Hello to everyone. Today's presenter is Argyris Sakalis, and he's a PhD candidate in University of Sheffield. He will be in the job market this year, and his research interests are economic development, political economy, and economic history. So, Argyris, the floor is yours. You can start.
I hope you can see everything.
Yes.
Okay. So hello, thank you for inviting me, George. We'll be talking about a research project with my two supervisors. It's my third chapter. It's about property rights, development, and agricultural production, and it's about early 20th century Greece. So the transition of Greece from the late 19th to 20th century. And as you can probably tell, if you are into this literature, you know that for the majority of human history, agriculture was the primary source of livelihood. The transition out of the so-called Malthusian trap and into industrial and post-industrial economies has not been the same for all countries. The role of land ownership is notable in this transition, if you are familiar with Galore and unified growth theory in general. Obviously, property rights have a significant importance in development. This has been a finding in this literature. And I will be talking more specifically about the types of ownership status. And this has ranged historically between individual ownership, so for instance, haciendas in Latin America, where you have owners that will rely on contracted workers. And you do have, for instance, forms of cooperative ownership, such as the kibbutz system in Israel. So these are more or less the two, let's say.
Sorry, Argyris. Sorry, they try more people to enter. And they
I'm sorry. Now they should be joining. Yep. Yeah, should have left them. Are they good now?
Let's go partition. Yes, I guess.
Okay.
Wait. So, yes, I think we are.
Hi.
Oh, hi. Sorry for not letting you in. It was my part. I'm sorry. Yeah. So again, there's been two types of ownership status in general, historically, individual and cooperative ownership. And in general, differences in land ownership have been linked to early investment in human capital and differences in economic growth. This is much more of a general introduction, but obviously there's been much more theoretical rather than empirical work into how the ownership status is connected with agricultural choices, and specifically how it impacts the choice of production. So there are different motivations between cash and stable crops, and by cash crops are the crops that are grown for profit. So for instance, you can think of sugarcane, coffee, tobacco, but it can also be cereals. So for instance, wheat, if you have large economies of scale that allow it. On the other hand, you have staple crops, which are grown for substance. So for instance, barley, maize, or rice. In theory, the expectation, and most of the models have concluded that this is much more or less the expectation, is that private ownership will focus on cash crops, so profit, while you have cooperative forms, usually they tend to prioritize staple crops, which makes sense in some way, I guess. But again, depending on ownership type, the overall production of agricultural economy is affected, which is the case that I will be analyzing more or less. So the problem is that property rights in general, they're not exogenous, as you can probably tell, and they depend on various underlying characteristics, geography, capital requirements, for instance. There is little empirical evidence linking the type of ownership to agricultural production. There is one recent exemption from Montero, a very, very interesting paper. I think he's about to publish on Journal of Political Economy, where he uses a very interesting land reform in El Salvador during the 1980s. And he has one of the very, very good empirical evidence on this type of research. But our goal here is to add to this literature by examining historical cases of change in property rights for the late 19th century Greece. Just a bit of introduction in Greece. Greece was, as you can probably guess, a small agricultural economy at the time. In 1881, after the conference of Constantinople, or Istanbul, as you may call it, Greece expanded towards northern territories, mainly the area of Thessaly. What's interesting in this case is that agricultural estates of this area, they used to rely on customary Ottoman law, but were now recognized by the Greek state as private properties. Essentially, this was an attempt to transition from a semi-feudal system towards a market-based economy for the first time. This is a map of Greece. So Greece today is much larger than it used to be. In white, you can see, for instance, all the regions that are part of Greece now. With blue, you can see the Kingdom of Greece up until 1880. And with green, you can see the annexations of 1881. So Thessaly and another region of Arta. And this is the region of interest, the area of interest. So most part of Thessaly, you can see it on the purple. So during the Ottoman period, agricultural villages would follow variations of cooperative systems, essentially. So you will have sifts, or tsifliki as they called in Greece, which are large estates that share aspects of risk and profits between owners and workers. So essentially, it was a type of feudal system where you did have owners, but they were always operating under, the Ottoman law. So it wasn't as strictly defined as it is today, the property rights per se. And you have, on the other hand, these smaller estates, so which were essentially free villages, as you will translate this, kefalochorion, which follow a communal organization in most aspects of social life. So both these estates, in one way or another, would share aspects of risk and profit. So being an owner at this time wasn't as significant as it became after the annexation of 1881. So following the cession of the region of Thessaly to Greece, all of these shares of land would now become private estates in the eyes of Greek state. And the change in this ownership status provides a variation to identify the effects of property rights on agricultural choices and development. The main interest lies here between the period of 1880s to 1910s, because it is exactly after the expansion and before the next one that took place in 1912. So, as I've already alluded to, property rights changed in Thessaly, but they become more complicated due to a variety of reasons. So for instance, you have workers that were demanding use of land over estates that were settled over generations, and this was actually quite a controversial thing at the time. And you also have landless who were starting to making claims over lands that belong to the community, so they can work on them by themselves. And especially in the larger estates at the time, the rights of the workers were not recognized. Tsifliki essentially in Greece is synonymous with big private ownership. So there is, let's say, this period of turmoil, but we're looking at the period right after the 30-year interval. So we're not looking directly at the beginning of the period, we're looking in the long run effect, essentially, not long run, but semi-long run. So as you can probably tell, this is a primarily empirical research, so it's heavily depending on data. And we do have data about the property rights and population during that era. And we have it from historical archives, from projects. And we do have information about the property rights in 1907 and population in 1881 and 1907 at the community level. So we have the smaller level of aggregation communities, which form municipalities, who then form counties. And I will show you a bit how this looks. And this had to be digitized and merged with data from boundaries of local authorities from the 1990s Greece, taken from the Holistic Statistical Authority. And essentially, the main difficulty of this was to actually individually match and trace back in time these boundaries to essentially create the boundaries of these municipalities and communities at the 1880s. So this is just an example of data. You can see on the left, you have the villages, the name of the villages, and you have the regimes on the middle. And here, for instance, you have the population numbers between 1881, 1907, and in between. And this is just to show you the variation. So you have different regimes. And what do these regimes, how does this look like? So this is the area I was talking before, Thessaly. These are essentially the communities. And initially they belonged in two categories. So the two main categories I already said is Chifliki and Kefalohoria, which is the shifts and the villages. So you can think of them as the two main original ownership categories. After the transition and up until the 1910s, the categories were now transformed. You have shifts, so you have Ottoman, Christian, and mixed shifts. So essentially larger properties. So on the one, you will have Ottomans, Christians, and mixed. In the mixed categories, you will have, as I will further explain, individuals who were workers will now be taking part into the ownership. So essentially we're sharing ownership. And on the other hand, you have three more categories spawning out from the second one. So you will have free villages. So VL stands for the libres. Everything is from French in Greek historical terms. The ones that were bought out of from the workers directly out of the Greek states, or were distributed to them from the Greek states. So by using this information, essentially, you can have a map of the ownership back in the 1881. And this is how it looked like. So this is essentially the distribution of ownership in Thessaly in 1911. So you have the different categories, and some regions which are the most the city ones, not the urban ones. We don't have information on the urban. We have just on the lands who was outside of the big cities, essentially. Not that big cities. But, yeah. So but using this, we create a treatment indicator. So essentially, for communities where workers became private owners or shared ownership for the first time. So the baseline here will take the value 0 if a community belongs to either one of three types. So either the states that remained organized as before, so the Ottoman shifts, or larger states that belong to Christians. And similarly, the states that remained organized in a communal life. So in practice, you can think of them as the places where things didn't change that much, in the sense of they were not related to ownership for the first time. So you can think of the treatment as the places that actually you have all owners that were not owners before. So you are either ex-workers or you are landless that became owner for the first time. So essentially the treatment is becoming an owner for the first time, and specifically a small landowner most of the time. So again, the R's and the P's stand for places that were either bought back or distributed by the state, or in places where owners actually had ownership with the bigger owners. And using this, we also create an additional treatment variable. Well, we do measure the share of treatment within each municipality, because as I told you before, you have communities forming a municipality and municipalities forming counties. So we did this by calculating the amount of land used for each treated community within municipality. So essentially, by dividing the treated land with the total community land, you have a measurement of the treatment share within its community. Because you may have 3 communities out of 5 that were treated, inside the municipality. But with this way, we do give those communities which were larger more weight, essentially. So it's a weighted approach to the treatment share that each municipality had. And you will see why we use this. And a few words about the data. So the agriculture census of 1911 is used. It's taken from the library, the digital library of Elstat. It includes information on aspects of agricultural production for various crops across Greece. Our main interest lies within the amount of land used for agriculture. This is again at the community level. And we do focus primarily on dominant cereal crops like wheat, maize, barley, and we also include tobacco. So essentially wheat and barley are much more of the cash crops in our case, while maize is the more subsistence crop, so the stable crop. And we do calculate the share of crop towards the overall land of each community. This is just an example of the data. So you see here that you have the wheat, the maize, and these are the places, so the communities within a certain municipality. And we also have information about years prior to 1900s. So we have specific information about wheat, maize, barley, and tobacco. And by using this information, we can create differences for land shares. And in this way, we essentially have what happens, what's the share of land used for a specific crop in 1881 and 1907, and the difference between them. The thing is that this is on the municipality level. So we have the difference on the municipality level. This is just some descriptive statistics. So you can see that across the board for all 47 municipalities, the share of land used for almost all the crops increased. But you do see that there is bigger variation for wheat, for instance. The first step here is to investigate the impacts of the change in ownership, so our treatment, on the share on land devoted for each crop. So this is essentially simple OLS in the sense that we don't have differences for the treatment share, we just assigned it in a quasi-matter. So again, for every crop, it's the size of land allocated for each crop as a share of total land area. For a municipality, we have the treatment share, which is the share of communities, the share of land for communities with a change in the municipality, so those that were treated. We do control for population density in each municipality. We have region-specific shocks, and all regressions are weighted using the municipality population of 1881. And we do see that there is an effect. So for regions that had a higher share of treatment, so essentially the regions where you have owners for the first time, so ex-workers or landlords becoming owners for the first time, you see that they tended to increase the land share devoted for wheat and for barley as well. And even though it's not significant, it's negative for maize. So maize is, again, the stable crop in this case. So when they were given essentially property rights, they tended to go to the cash crops, more or less in line with what you would expect for people going into ownership for the first time. We also have an instrument. So we are using rainfall essentially as a measurement of soil quality at the time, because at the time, as you can tell, most agriculture was relying on rainfall, and this was the same with area of the Thessaly at the time. We're using climatic data from FAO, and we're creating the variable rainfall. So this is the average of precipitation levels at the region. And we argue that this exogenous variation will have an effect because more or less you do have essentially the better estates, the most fertile were the seeds. So you expect that in these places where they were giving or had in ownership for the first time, you will see that there was a negative effect. And this is what we actually see. So again, the first stage here includes rainfall on the treatment share, and then the second stage is similar to the one I already showed you. And more or less, it's the same regressions as before. So you do have similar effects. So again, you have a positive effect on wheat and barley, but a negative effect on maize. And again, the first stage shows that for higher levels of precipitation for these regions, you have a negative effect on the treatment, in what sense that these were the places that were the least fertile. So they were less likely to be given to small owners. And then we proceed to see whether this had a joint effect on development. So this is essentially the difference in differences that we're actually employing. So now we use the same more or less variables with before. So the crops, either wheat, maize, and barley. And we want to see what's the interaction with the change in ownership. So the treatments are in 1911. Again, all variables are the same, but now we want to see whether this has an effect on development. So this is the change population density between 1881 and 1911. And now we're clustering the standards at the municipality level because one of the two variables is at the municipality level. I'm sorry, in this case, there are both of them. I will do them in a different level in a bit. So the main interest here relies on the multiplicative effect. So you see that the treatment will have a positive effect on the population, but when you interact it with the change in the land size devoted to wheat or any other crop for that matter, you see that there is a negative effect. And you can see that even with adding the regional fixed effects and controls, it doesn't really change. And one of the things we want to do, because we think it's providing a clearer picture, is to then go and drop some of the communities that, as you can probably tell, due to merges, there are many uncertainties because you have communities that belongs to different categories of treatment, which had to be merged in the first stage. So we drop some of these observations to have a clearer picture, and we call this a clear signal sample. And as you can see, it makes sense that it strengthens the results in the sense that you have a better picture of which exactly of the communities were treated or not, and you can be more certain of that. And now we also proceed to use the community level new owners variable I said in the beginning. So now again, it's more or less the same equation. The only difference is that now we have the community level treatment instead of the municipality level, the new owners variable. But again, we cluster at the municipality level because the share of crops, the change in the share of crops is the municipality level. And we do get similar results, primarily for wheat, as you see. So again, the interaction term is the most important of this factor because you see that for higher change in share of wheat in these places with new ownership of new private owners, you have a negative effect on the density of population between 1881 and 1911, which is one of the indirect measures of development for the time. And as you can see now, we have 365 observations compared to 401. And a few robustness as well, if we have time. Yeah, I think we have a few minutes. And there may be different conditions between treated and untreated. The initial conditions between may be different. So we do see that if we correlate just what's the share of these different ownership status, we do see that places, for instance, the free villages were less likely to produce wheat in 1881, while other places like the sieves, the Ottoman sieves and the mixed ownership were more likely to produce wheat. So if we take this into account, we can just drop combinations of these communities to see whether results hold. And this is primarily done for wheat. I can also show you the other crops if you're interested. But yeah, the main point here is that when we drop different communities from our samples, so for instance, the Ottoman sieves or the mixed ownership or the free villages, you can see that now the sample is much smaller, but again, the joint effect is negative and statistically significant. And the same holds if we drop even all the shifts or all the V's or a combination of two, which doesn't hold if you look to the other crops, so maize or barley and tobacco. If you do the same exercise, you see that they're not significant at every point, which reinforces the main finding, which is centered around wheat as a cash crop of the time. And this is just to compare the two different treatments. So on the left-hand side, you have the community level treatment. You can see it's much more, it's closer. So it's better estimated compared to the municipality, which again, obviously you see that there is a similar effect, and it is positive. Again, the treatment for different levels of wheat share difference, but you see that if you have higher shares of wheat share difference, that's why you are getting a negative effect in the term that you saw earlier. So just to conclude, we used historical data on early 20th century Greece to investigate how a change in property rights affect the region, and the transition from a semi-feudal economy towards a market economy seems to direct agriculture towards wheat, which was the cash crop at the time, as I told you. But the problem is that in areas with higher shares of wheat agriculture, of change in higher shares, they experience a change towards smaller ownership, and this had a negative effect on population growth. So essentially, the argument is that they tended to focus on a cash crop, which was not beneficial in the long run for the population density, if that's a correct approximation of development. So yeah, this is it. Please let me know if you have any suggestions or questions.
Hi, I have one couple of questions. Thanks, first of all, thanks for the seminar. It was great.
I'm sorry, I cannot hear you.
Can you?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, thanks for the seminar. It was great. Good job, and well, congrats for your work. It's very innovative, I would say. And well, it's just, I mean, a couple of doubts. First of all, regarding the use of population density as control. So you were not that clear, or at least, or maybe I missed something. But I guess that, or I would suggest you to use population density in 1981. Otherwise,
that was a population density in 1881. Yeah,
as
so
control.
the initial. I use it as control both in the beginning and when you have the differences later on.
But it's always the initial.
Yeah, it is always the initial.
Okay, that's great. Okay,
otherwise I think it's on the slides like population density in 1881.
Maybe I missed this point. And then the other more general question is about the use of land. So if I will understand, correct me if I'm wrong, you are supposing that land is just used for agriculture, right? So in a way, you can change the destination of land. So maybe if it's more convenient to produce, after the change in property rights, it's more convenient to produce crops. Maybe you stop building a farm, and you change the destination of the land to crops, or maybe you demolish buildings, and I mean, maybe it makes no sense, but this is my only doubt.
I understand. It's like whether they change or not the structure of their property during this period, right? What we measure is just the 2 points in time, whether the overall land in a village is dedicated to one share of crop or another. We cannot directly capture individual farms. Yeah, obviously. We do have the more or less aggregate effect for each village, which we have the property.
But if you do have the aggregate, you can also, if you see a change in the aggregate, it might be due to a change in the share of the total land devoted to crops, or not.
So you have more arable land, in essence. You say that it was compared to newer founding. Yes, we do have the arable land again, but again, the problem is whether we agree that this is accurately measured at the time. So the best, yeah, exactly. So the best argument here is that we do have for certain the total land, which is much more easy to be certain about, right? So that's the main argument. But we do use arable land as well, and we have similar results. So out of the share of arable land, but yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes. Hello. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's, I think it's very interesting and very Greek, I would say as well. So it's very focused on the ancient Greek, I would say. And well, for me, it was pretty nice just to learn many things from your country. I wonder if you could, if you thought about investigating the role of type of land, suitability for every crop.
Yes, the problem is that the data that you obtain from suitability raster files, for instance, from the Food and Agriculture Organization, it's a much more lower quality in the pixels. So you are not able to have proper measurements because it is a very small region. But yeah, it was one thing we thought about, obviously. That's why we would use rainfall, for instance, instead of suitability, because we cannot create instrument at that point.
There is this paper from Henderson and co-authors, I don't remember the year, in which they developed a measure of the suitability for how they call that.
If they do have good analysis on the data, so like
but
then it may be usable, because the ones I've tried, you're not able to have variation that would make sense for these kinds of observations, because again, there are small villages essentially in a very small part of Greece. So we're talking about a few hundred square kilometers.
So there are indeed there are no major differences in the type of land, probably between an area of another.
Again, there will be, but they're not able to be captured by the data I have seen for the global suitability of agriculture. So if someone has better data, which I guess is probably something that is doing.
Then I have another question related with the geography of the area, because I don't know if you can present a map of the area, if there is any close port or if there's mountainous land, etc. But the reality in Barcelona, where we are in this type of in this period, more or less, is very curious that the farther you go from the coast, okay, you change with the coast. Of course, it usually concentrates the majority of population, and then it displaces the type of agriculture is different from places where you have few people. You have the same amount of land, but you have more people in one place and less people in another. So what finally turns out is that you need some type of crop which is capable of be able to be transported.
Yeah, that's a whole different problem for this region, because even if you take the distance, you will somehow have to account for the fact that they were not able to move around the region at the same ease. So we have historical accounts describing how different this would be between regions that appear very close on the map, but in practice you will be very, very hard to move around. So yeah, it is a very important thing to consider. Unfortunately, we're not able to somehow have concrete evidence of how exactly they were moving around at the time. So we don't have a way to measure this essentially. But yeah, I understand that it is a thing that's, in more modern economies, it's something you probably are able to capture better. But for Greece at the time, I don't think you will be able to capture that. No.
Okay. That's all.
But it is a valid point. It is a valid point.
But maybe I missed that. But did you make any type of spatial econometric regression, or just controlling this type of, because you have a lot of very close, this is a very heterogeneous.
So one of the things we would like to do is spatial RDD, but the problem is we don't have exactly defined changes for regions. But yeah, in principle, we could try something in the future for this. Yeah, but it is again something. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Are there any questions or comments or? Argyris, I have also some questions.
Yeah, I hope it doesn't stop recording because it was a 40-minute limit, but yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay. Can you go back to the IV estimates?
Yeah, of course.
With the instrument. I think it was the first.
You mean this one?
No, it was one table with 4. Yes, this one. So I wanted to ask you, basically the first and the third column are very close to the OLS coefficient, right?
They're not that close, but they're supposed to be the similar, estimation. So 126 and
it is 3.9 column here, right?
Yeah.
So the OLS then are fine, right? They don't have, I don't know.
I guess because we do have a very small, control variables. Essentially, we don't have that many differences. This is not a very big sample of many controls, so it is logical that you have very similar results in that sense. If we had 30 controls, then probably the estimation would be more different than it is. But yeah, it is something. Yeah, I should look further into, to be honest.
And one more question. I'm not in this literature, so I don't know. But I wanted to explain to me more about how the instrument, it is the rainfall, right?
Is the precipitation, yes. So essentially it is a measure to capture indirectly the soil quality at the time, because if you have seen papers with precipitation and temperature, you see that the variation over time, even if you are like 100 years, is not that much significant over time. So even if you have something from the 70s or the average from 20-30 years, most people have argued that this is a good way of indirectly capturing a parameter which is exogenous. So that's one of the main reasons behind it. The soil quality would be a better instrument, but we don't have the ability, as I said, to create this for the municipality level at Greece.
Yes, because I think that, yes, I don't know, but the rainfall is not associated with the crops.
Yeah, it is associated, but this is, again, the point about the source of land being devoted and not the production per se. So this is, if it is raining, it's not increasing here per se, whether you have this permanently or not devoted for crops. Because, yeah, it is related, but it's not this, directly related in that sense. But it is a point that we have been thinking about, if it is a good instrument in that sense for the exogeneity, exactly. Because otherwise it makes sense for us, but it is something we have to scrutinize more. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, that was my comment.
Can I add something related to your previous point?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem here is, related to Georgios' comments about IV, it's not that you have few controls, because if your instrument work, the inclusion of controls will at most increase the precision of your IV estimates. So the problem is that you have 47 observations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and IV it's a consistent estimator, if any. So therefore I suggest you to either apply the small sample correction or to use limited information maximum likelihood to estimate the IV, this system of equations, because they perform, so maximum likelihood, limited information maximum likelihood performs better than two-stage least squares when you have so few observations. So that this could, change a little bit the evidence with respect to OLS, but don't expect any miracle.
No.
You always have 47 observations.
Yeah, I know, and that's one of the problems that if you focus on such a small sample, and that's the reason why we initially started, and we are focusing more or less on the community sample because it's much larger sample.
Yeah.
But yeah. Okay. Should I stop recordings? Is everything final?
Yes.
Okay.
I can thank you very much for this nice presentation and for your interesting paper. Thank you everyone for attending this lunch seminar. I hope see you, all of you, in the next seminar of AQR.
See you. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice
Thank you,
day.
Argyris.